Hey everybody, Paul and I just finished a conversation with a friend of his, Dave Mance, who works for Christian Solidarity Worldwide, which is going to be our devotional this week, focusing on prayer for persecuted Christians around the world. And yeah, it's just a really good conversation about how we can pray specifically into that, but also practically how we can advocate for people. But anyway, we're going to make this one public, which we don't normally do with our online devotionals. Normally they're just for our church family. But we just thought this would be a good conversation to put out there for people to listen in on. Also, I'm going to put a link to CSW in the description under the video, so you can go and check out more resources, more ways of getting involved, and how to actually act on anything that you feel challenged by from this video. Yeah, so feel free to share it around, and hope you enjoy.
Well, welcome, Dave Mance. It's very, very good that we can have you with us for this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening, whenever people happen to be watching this. So, do you want to tell us who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a long-time friend of yours, Paul. If you're willing to admit that much.
Absolutely.
In fact, yeah, Mertha has always got a special place in our hearts. That's where we got engaged, and it's got a special place in my heart. I don't know how Mrs. Mance feels about it. But yeah, my role is head of campaigns at CSW. We're a human rights organisation. We specialise in religious freedom. We're a Christian organisation. We believe that it's so important that we speak up, not just for persecuted Christians, but actually for anyone who's persecuted for what they believe. So, yeah, and I'm based in Guildford, which is nearish to London, quite posh.
So one of the things that that we've been wanting to grow in as a church is prayer, and not just self-interested kind of parochial us kind of centered prayer, but like looking at what Jesus is doing across the world. I think one of the things that myself and Tom were chatting about the other day is this idea that we can be quite disengaged and almost feel like it's a little bit depersonalized when there's stuff going on around the world that is sort of far from our experience. And so, like, how can we stay engaged and emotionally invested with things that are actually quite far removed from our life experience?
Yeah, and that's a really good question. It's really good that you can kind of be self-aware in that way, because obviously in my line of work, I'm like, well, everyone should care passionately about this issue and think about it every day, and it's just not realistic, is it? And I think one thing I would do if I was kind of speaking on a Sunday there, I'd kind of just relate it first of all right back to us here, and say, if we happen to be Christians elsewhere in the world, what would that look like? And, for you, Paul, with your, reaching out into your community and becoming known and seeing people come to know God, then, you might just start getting a lot of pressure from local authorities. And then one day there's a knock at your door and, a dozen police come through, grab you and haul you off, and no one knows where you've gone, or when you're coming back, or if you're coming back, and what's happening to you, and so to just think about it in those terms. What if it were happening right here, and what would it mean for me? Just as a normal member of the church, you also wouldn't be immune. You would be, suddenly getting a lot of pressure from, your landlord might be wanting to say, hey, you need to move out because you can't stay here, or your kids might not be able to go to school. And so I just think it's helpful to think about it in those terms first of all. That's one way of just kind of getting a bit more emotionally engaged with the issue and bringing it home to us. And then stories, like just being open to hearing those stories. For example, just to give you an example, what's happening at the moment. So right now in Nigeria, church leaders are really they're so much at risk of being targeted by terrorist groups, and that hasn't really changed with the curfew. So when I was over there a couple of years ago, for example, just there was a there was a group. So there's a group called the Fulani Militia, who you may probably haven't even have heard of, or won't have heard of very, very much, but actually the fourth deadliest terrorist group in the world. And they are a nomadic people, and they've become kind of radicalized in recent years. And so I was just visiting kind of communities that have been attacked as Christians, have been attacked by that group. And I went into a place that's wasn't that remote, wasn't that far away from the town of Jos, but it was just kind of a bit difficult to get to. You're going into some kind of distant, very, very difficult roads to get out there. And what had happened a few days before is just this, the cry had gone up, the Fulani are coming, and people had been kind of ushered in by the security people into this school building, and the people that should have been protected them say, hey, go in there. And then they'd gone in there, and doors had been locked, and the Fulani militia had come and massacred 18 people inside that schoolroom, men, women, and kids. And it's, that kind of thing is just it's hard to get our heads around, that kind of story. And but it's, it is so important that we do kind of let ourselves be open occasionally to hearing those kind of stories, and not just kind of turning the other way. And so that would be my second point, would be to just try to listen, open ourselves up occasionally.
Yeah.
And my last thought on that, on just staying, on how we can kind of stay engaged, something that I find helpful is not a big prayer thing, but just taking moments in a day. If I grab I didn't put this prop here for this purpose, but seeing as it's right here, when I grab a cup of coffee and chocolate, they're things that are often made in countries where there are a lot of religious freedom violations. And just that little point of connection, if I'm making a coffee and sitting and drinking it, just to take a couple of minutes just to think on these things and say a prayer for those that are persecuted in those countries, just helps us find a little connection point in our day. That can also be good.
It seems like, when we hear these kind of stories, it's such an overt evil, and maybe in the West, evils take a more subtle form a lot of the time. But it feels so kind of raw and even demonic in a sense, this evil against vulnerable people. And so when it comes to that, do you see prayer as a way that tackles that in some senses where, I don't know, practical stuff can't? There's almost like a spiritual element to it as well?
Yeah, absolutely. We always say, we're an advocacy organization. Our role is really speaking to those in power, speaking truth to those in power, and calling for change in that way. But we also always say that our greatest advocacy tool is prayer. And just to give you one example, so with China, they're a superpower, and a lot of the time, like, lobbying is not really very effective, because they're like, well, we're China, we don't really care. And it's about 4 years ago, actually, when I first started working for CSW, and there was this case of a human rights lawyer in China who'd sort of spoken up he was a Christian, he'd spoken up for Christians being persecuted, and he himself was put in detention and kind of disappeared in a black jail. And I just felt, I really we want to do prayer for him. We organized 24 hours of prayer. And I also felt like, I really want to do a protest. And, in terms of like what we call a theory of change, like, how will this action make any difference? To go and stand outside the Chinese consulate in London and, light candles and pray and sing and those kind of things doesn't actually make any sense. But I really felt, we should do this, and we did, and took the whole family up, made it a fun family day out. And then, handed in a petition, went home again. And then, just shortly after that, we really quite remarkably saw the release of this human rights lawyer, Lee Ho-ping, and there was really no reason for them to release him. And when they did release him, he spoke very openly about the torture he'd suffered, and it was, quite an embarrassment really for the regime. And so, things like that, it just does bring home to you the importance of that kind of, spiritual warfare.
Yeah, it's great. So are there like resources that you guys have which can help churches like ours praying specifically? Because I think that's the thing. Sometimes, when you start praying about the persecuted church, it feels like such this general kind of depersonalized, no faces, no names thing that makes it hard to engage on an emotional level, So what would you recommend for us in that?
Yeah, well, there's a few things. So we do a weekly email which goes out, which has a kind of specific case each time, an individual or a country focus or something like that. So you could sign up to that, or one of if you as a leader did that, and then now and then you bring that to the church. That's a really great way. Mm-hmm. We also do a very basic, but have a prayer diary, and you can just read about a very specific thing each day and pray through that. And we've been doing some, for example, we actually held a prayer event about, a couple of weeks ago, an online prayer event on Zoom, and that worked really well. It was focused on the case of a girl called Leah Sharibu, who you may have heard of her case. A couple of years ago, she was abducted in Nigeria from school along with 109 others, and after a month, the government negotiated the release of the girls, and as they were heading back, they were literally in the trucks to go back, and it was Boko Haram who had grabbed these girls, and she was the only Christian among them, and they said, well, you can go with your classmates, you just need to renounce your faith. And she refused at that point, and they literally dragged her out of the truck, and she had to watch her friends drive home to safety and be back with their parents, and she stayed. And that happened a couple of years ago, but we've really kept on her case from advocacy and from a prayer point of view. And I think that kind of specific story of someone so young and so courageous for their faith really helps us to keep her in mind, and also keep the others like her in mind who've been snatched and still living in captivity. So there's a couple of ways there, hopefully, that you could engage with us. That would be great.
Great.
So just on a kind of global scale at the moment, where is overt persecution at its kind of highest level for Christians?
Pretty hard to measure in that sense. I suppose the kind of the stories we're hearing about, that you might be seeing in the news in China, where there are, as well as the church that I mentioned and Christians, you've got between 1 and 3 million Uyghur Muslims in re-education camps, targeted because of their ethnicity and their religion, and what's being put across as a kind of place for them to learn is actually just kind of like a concentration camp, really. It's so that's a big story. So there's ones like that which are very much in the news. At the same time, somewhere like Eritrea, which is known as the kind of often kind of talked about as the North Korea of Africa, because it's because this kind of completely authoritarian regime, but you just don't really hear about what's going on there, and stories of Christians and others who are jailed in shipping containers or underground cells in the desert, or just open air in the desert. And so I wouldn't try and very hard to kind of say what's where even it's kind of worse, because it just manifests very differently. And where you've got those examples, it's where it's the state that are repressing, whereas in somewhere like Nigeria, where I mentioned, it's a lot of non-state actors, it's terrorist groups, while the state kind of ignores it. And yeah, a lot of what's happening in Nigeria right now, happening to Christians, is just not being reported in the news at all. And it really is. It's the worst it's ever been there right now. And so many, like I say, church leaders being abducted and killed. Just a few months ago, one leader was taken and did a kind of video sort of home saying, don't worry, trust God. And, just an amazingly brave man who was sadly executed just a few days later. So, but yeah, a lot of those kind of the Fulani militia attacks that are happening against Christians, when it is reported over here, it's reported as just kind of clashes between groups, whereas in reality, it's people attacking people in their home and murdering.
One thing I've been thinking about ahead of this conversation is just how in the early church and right through to the Middle Ages, really, martyrdom was considered this ideal for disciples of Jesus. Like the martyrs were heroes to be emulated, and not because people wanted to die, but because of the extreme level of devotion required for martyrdom. And so they were seen as like these heroes of the faith that everybody wanted to emulate. And I was thinking about how for us Westerners, when it comes to the persecuted church, often we talk about them as victims to be rescued and miss that element of heroes to be emulated, and so I was just wondering, what is it that you think that we need to learn from these people who are willing to suffer so much for their faith? What can we receive from the example of their lives?
Yeah. There's some, because I've had a few Zoom chats with people where I've been able to interview the kind of people you're talking about and hear their stories. And there was a lady who in Iran was put in solitary confinement, and she was sharing about, it was the hardest time, but it was also in a strange way the best time, and because she just had to throw herself on God and really, like we read about Paul and Silas in prison worshipping, worship was really her key. She would, that was the way that she was able, in this bare room, which is like, 6 foot by 8 foot or whatever, with nothing in there other than a sink, just able to actually kind of be transported out of there through worship and to meet with God and change her perspective completely. And it is true, like they'll often, people who've been through that kind of thing will kind of almost feel sorry for us, in the sense that because our faith isn't tested in that way, we're not able to it's so easy for us to kind of take or leave our faith, because we're not forced to that point of decision. Do we really want this enough to go through those things? So I've kind of forgotten what your question was, Tom, but I've just talked a lot.
That's all right. Yeah, that's good. What are the things that you think that we can learn and receive from?
Yeah, sure. So I think we can be very, grateful for the freedoms we have and use the voice that we have here for them. But I think we can also be, find that a sobering thing, that it is very easy for us to kind of take or leave our faith, and really let ourselves be challenged by what they're willing to go through for their faith. And so when we do face obstacles, which we all do, for being Christian, then to face those, knowing that there are others around the world doing so too in their own way.
That's really helpful, because I think sometimes we can meet difficulty and it plunges us into questions of why God, why me, why is this happening, and it's kind of confusing to us sometimes. The scriptures around, like, rejoice, my brothers, when you encounter trials of various kinds. And I guess those stories you're telling of people who are finding God in an incredible way, even in the midst of such extreme suffering. It kind of makes sense of those scriptures a little bit more for me,
Yeah.
and maybe exposes what we're missing.
And you know what? You never hear them ask that question, like why? Like why? It seems to be something which we ask a lot. Why does God allow suffering? And yet those that are really suffering, particularly suffering for their faith, it's just not. It's weird, but it just kind of doesn't come up in a funny sort of way. It's just like, well, yeah, this is what we were promised.
Yeah.
This is what Jesus said would happen. And yeah, it's more about how do I get through this with God?
That's so helpful.
Yeah. So one of the things that you said earlier, obviously we want to grow in praying intelligently for our brothers and sisters, and I think we've been talking a lot because we've been going through the book of Philippians and the way that Paul talks about how I'm confident that through the Holy Spirit and your prayers, this will turn out for my deliverance. And I think we've been understanding how there's a real kind of participatory role for us in what Jesus is doing across the world through prayer. But you said about taking your kids to campaign outside the Chinese embassy. I love that idea. I guess it's a little bit less practical for us in Merthyr, kind of driving to the Chinese embassy. So obviously there's prayer that we want to grow in and be intelligent in the way that we pray and participate in what Jesus is doing. But how can we advocate for our brothers and sisters from Merthyr Tydfil in a real kind of practical, tangible way?
Yeah, well, we have we try and give people a range of ways really that they can get involved. So if you go to the CSW website, which is csw.org.uk, click on get involved there, then we tend to have a couple of campaign actions that you can do, and it can be as simple as I mentioned the situation with the Uyghur people in re-education camps in China. That's something which right now we're getting people to write to their MP about, and ask your MP to speak to those in power, and to use that at the moment, particularly with China. There's an opportunity there actually to kind of challenge them on that. So you can actually email your MP very, very simply. If you wanted to do something that is that kind of next level up, actually to write a letter, while we're kind of in lockdown, we're kind of trying to draw a real kind of army of letter writers, because to write to your MP is actually much more powerful than an email, because they actually have this bit of paper in front of them, and it shows someone really cares. So again, you can get those kind of resources on our website. You can actually write to those who are in prison, and you can write to those who are kind of in those really difficult places at the moment. And that is really, I find when I do that's another way to really get emotionally engaged, when you think some person on the other side of the world is actually going to be sitting in a very dark place, but they're going to be reading my words, and it really forces me to think, well, what are they going through right now, and what can I write as an encouragement? What Bible verse might I share, or those kind of things? And although that might not seem like a form of advocacy, actually, when those that are the prison authorities, when they see a lot of mail coming through from overseas, they're like, oh, okay, well, people around the world are aware of this person and how I treat them, and it does make them think twice, and it can actually make quite a marked difference. So there's a few ways. You don't have to until they get a Chinese embassy in Merthyr, there are still plenty of ways that you can take action.
Oh, that's great. No, thank you so much. And thanks for the work that you're doing as well. I think it's a few years back now, but I remember seeing the video of Omar from Cuba, which absolutely broke me, and it breaks me every time I see it. And I think it's that challenge then to go on a step from just having an emotional response to to someone's situation and actually doing something about it. And I'm really grateful for. I think we're really grateful for the work that you're doing to bring what's going on around the world to our attention, but also like making it really easy for us to get involved in actually doing something about it as well, something that's really tangible. And and again, I'm really grateful as well for the story of the release of the Chinese lawyer, because I think we can get into the idea that we pray, but it bounces off the ceiling and nothing actually makes a difference. And you could say, well, it's a coincidence, isn't it? But we don't believe it is. And we believe that we have a God who hears and answers prayer. And as you say, there's no reason why he should have been released on a human level. And so we're actually participating in something that makes a difference. So thank you so much for what you're doing.
Yeah, no, it's beautiful, isn't it? That partnership that we can have with God. And yeah, really grateful for the opportunity to just share a little bit, and for your kind of openness as a church to how God wants to use you in this way. And yeah, thanks for the chat.
Thank
Cheers,
you.
Dave. Nice to meet you.